Okay. Yeah, now it pop up in my Zoom. All right, thank you so much, everyone, to attend this conversation from Cafe Out Borders. So yeah, that means we try to keep it like coffee style, conversational style. We don't try to be really, too deep or really criticize, really show too academic kind of thing. We do hear some from the different perspective of academias in here, try to articulate the ideas and deal with the really huge topics that I myself will study on education, like other colleges in here, really feel enthusiastic with that. It's just education policy reforms and how we change it. That is, I think, is one of the most topics that we exciting to say, but it's hard to cover, and that's why we have in here three distinguished guests that I have in here that will do some brief introduction before we jump in on the conversation. We have here Dr. Teklu Bekele, from the AUC, the International Comparative Education. He have really profound study on the higher education blends with quantitative and qualitative methodologies and have multiple reward that he seen here, really great careers and an outstanding author contribution, Emerald Literature Award in 2019. And he also have a lot of significant project related to university society engagement in Africa with a framework of SDGs and the Africa 2063 agenda. Alef, thank you so much to be here, Dr. Berkeley. And I have in here Dr. Laura Vadivielzo, that she gonna have working on the, I believe that you're teaching in the University of Massachusetts, UMass, and have the study on the school, redefining schools as an agent of social justice. And she heavily doing research on diversity, pluralism, and knowledge production in education, challenging inequality. And she have the really expanded study on diverse cultural context, on a language policy, multicultural education, and indigenous schooling. And of course, the leading academic journals she can provide in the educational publications. Thank you to be here, Dr. Valiazel. I definitely would love to hear your study about the school as agents of the social justice, which is heavily related to social study that I'm really interested in. And lastly, we have Dr. Cliff Mayers, and we have, of course, working on like interim director in the Central International Education University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And we work with UNICEF in Asia and Pacific for a long time and do have their insights on early childhood development and basic educations, and have 23 in academia careers that now he want to be expect to bring up with us a lot of ideas about complexity of donor demands and national interest in based on his experience in their Laos PTR. That really happy to have Dr. Clifford here because Laos is really a neighbor of Vietnam, and we do have a lot of conversation with them. Then I hope we learn something a lot from this. And this is, and of course we have Liama in here, the founder of this Cafe Without Border groups, and thanks to her support and her warm invitation, we have this conversation. I have three distinct scholar in here can share their knowledge, and we try to be understand a different, I think, different facets of this huge topic, and hopefully we'll come out something. And as a scholar working in academia, hopefully can find some interesting topics to start writing some publication, right? All right. So thank you so much. So as a moderator, I just make it clear that we're doing set up the tone. Let's just conversational style, and we're just going through like order in here by my screen. That Dr. Bekele will gonna be go first, roughly about 10 to 15 minutes, and then Dr. Vadierezo is going to go after, and Dr. Clifford closing our keynote speaking session. And after that, we can have some general discussion about all the idea that we feel profound and want to discuss deeper. And during that time, we can provide some Q&A that people can feel free can adding on the chat box, and we can go to that question after that. Is that everybody okay with that? Okay, I see a lot of looking head in here. So please welcome Dr. Bekele. Here the floor for you.
Thank you very much, Pham and Lamia, for coordinating this specific session. Pretty interesting. Okay, I have a PowerPoint, but I got to adjust my style right now. So I'm going to kind of give you guys a brief overview of my work on education policy reform in Africa. So before that, the work I'm going to share with you right now, is kind of part of a special issue, which is going soon to be published in IRE, International Review of Education. So this special issue is coordinated by Dr. William Smith at the University of Edinburgh. So my work is part of that special issue, and it focused primarily on how and to what extent this least studied intergovernmental organization called the African Union is kind of recontextualizing or interpreting the global sustainable development goals. So that's my primary stay. So I'm not going to discuss policies at the national and institutional levels, but I'm gonna focus on the kinds of reform movements which are happening at the continental regional level. Because much of the scholarship when it comes to global governance and when it comes to education policy making specifically, it kind of focuses on global development regimes and national and institutional policies. So what seems to be overlooked is how and to what extent intergovernmental organizations are actually redefining, recontextualizing, or operationalizing the global sustainable development goals. So the African Union is kind of going to be my kind of unit of analysis for my talk right now. And the specific focus will be on how and to what extent this, what appears to be emerging intergovernmental organization, the African Union, aspires to contribute to policy reform in its 55 member nations in Africa. So it's kind of a really big intergovernmental organization, and we have so many countries as kind of members. And the basic anything the African Union is going to develop is going to be reflected in national education policies. So that is a basic assumption. But when it comes to how and to what extent that policy prescription by the African Union is going to be practiced at the national level, that is a completely different topic, which I'm not going to discuss today. So the question is this, how does the African Union redefine the sustainable development goals in its attempt to come up with locally relevant policy reform for Africa? So that's my question. And to sort of answer these ambitious questions, I kind of have carefully chosen 3 policy strategies developed by the African Union. And these policy strategies and policy reforms, they kind of are methodical and intentional ways of redefining the global sustainable development goals. So one focus entirely on the ideas and conceptions of sustainability. And within that, of course, we have discussions linked specifically to educational policy. But the main focus of the first reform is on sustainability. What does that mean and how does that relate to African realities, et cetera, et cetera. So they discuss the environment and civil wars and how that affects our future, et cetera, et cetera. And then the second policy document talks about what is likely to happen in Africa all the way until 2063. By 2063, the African Union is going to celebrate its centennial anniversary. So they have kind of developed educational and development strategy geared to be achieved by 2063. And this strategy is again significantly and directly linked to the global sustainable development goals. And then the third one, which kind of emerges from the first two policy strategies, refers exclusively to educational policymaking and development in its 55 member nations. So the third one is absolutely entirely on education, while the first two policy documents, they refer to so many complex ideas such as sustainability, global governance, partnerships, and et cetera, et cetera. So my study examined these policy documents using critical discourse analysis. And when it comes to theory, I kind of tried to use both consensus and conflict-driven theories. So the basic assumption is that policymaking at the continental level is kind of considered to be part of global governance. Okay, if we accept this assumption, we might be tempted to argue that then it makes sense to sort of subscribe to both consensus and conflict-driven theories when it comes to explaining issues linked to policy development and governance at the continental level. So specifically linked to conflict-driven theories, I have chosen 4 concepts developed by McDonald, and I have used other concepts linked to consensus-driven theories. Basically, they are related to institutional policies by Mears and his colleagues. So these are kind of my meta-level theoretical frameworks, which of course didn't have any dictating role when it comes to making my analysis, but definitely they were kind of found to be relevant to make analysis of African Union's 3 policy reforms. So let me then highlight on the most significant findings I got from this discourse analysis of the 3 reform documents by the African Union. And the first set of findings could be linked to what's this thing called discourse emergence. So the basic assumption is that we could consider sometimes at least education policies as discourses and as expressions and or manifestations of varied forms of power, yeah? And then if you believe in that, then it makes sense to sort of examine, interrogate, and study how did these 3 policy documents prepared by the African Union emerge in the first place? Of course, taking into consideration the global sustainable development goals. So I got some 3 specific findings which explain the emergence of African sustainable development goals, yeah, vis-a-vis the global sustainable development goals. One idea is linked to social historicism. So the basic assumption is that any policy or discourse is created within historical context and within and taking into consideration culture, the economic and political standing of nations and regions. So under this assumption, we have two justifications provided by the African Union when it comes to, or when it's related to social historicism linked to the emergence of the three policy documents. One is linked to the unfinished business of the Millennium Development Goals in Africa. So you remember those ambitious goals, yeah, the Millennium Development Goals, which expired by 2015. So when you consider Africa, the African continent in general, most of the development goals were not achieved by 2015. For a number of significant factors, the African Union believes that it is because of one, civil wars and conflicts in the region. Another one, it was because of the irrelevance of so many of the Millennium Development Goals to African reality, etc., etc. So that means the African version of the SDGs were developed to complete or to make sure that the unfinished business of the Millennium Development Goals are going to be achieved by 2030. So from this point of view, we can argue that the African version of the SDGs are nothing but extensions of the Global Sustainable Development Goals. So we're going to achieve the unachieved business of the Millennium Development Goals by 2030. So this is one aspect. The other is that it is predecessor organization. It is called the Organization for African Unity. This is an organization which predates the African Union, yeah? So the OAU, Organization of African Union, had that significant ambition of realizing African development potential, and they believed in the philosophy of Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance, etc., etc. And then what did happen by the time of its expiry? None of its objectives were met, suddenly. So what does that mean when it comes to recontextualizing the SDGs to the African reality? The African Union tries to rectify the challenge and problems of the organization of the African Union. So what does that mean? The African version of the SDGs are going to sort of become relevant only in the sense of achieving the unachieved ambitions of the OAU, such as Pan-Africanism, Renaissance, etc., etc. So the African Union has that ambition of achieving all this by 2030. So these are kind of some of the ideas linked to social historicism. And another rationale behind the emergence of African SDGs is linked to subscription to and/or because of some pressure from so many development regimes, such as, of course, the SDGs and so many accompanied development regimes, both at the global, continental, and national levels. I'm not going to detail them, but the African Union argues that because of the availability of all this long list of development regimes, that means development strategies, we got to have the African version of the SDGs. So you could argue that at some point, the African Union learned something about development, education, development, and governance from these available documents. But at times, you feel that this intergovernmental organization, the African Union, was kind of under pressure to do something new. So all these development strategies, they implicitly oblige the African Union to try something new. So that's why we have the three policy documents. And then the last under emergence is absolutely significant. And a significant part of the three policy development strategies, they explain it. The basic assumption is that the African Union complains a lot about the unfair and exclusive nature of global governance. That was kind of, you can feel it, yeah? When you read the three documents, the African Union had been extremely marginalized when it comes to, one, suggesting policy agendas at the global level. Two, when it comes to making the final decisions linked to that. So there are explicit statements about this. And specifically, the African Union mentions a specific number of organizations such as the Bretton Woods organizations, such as the IMF, the World Bank, and all that. So the African Union, they really believe that these international organizations intentionally, methodically marginalize the African Union. So what does that imply then? Then this time around, when it comes to the 2030 goals, the African Union aspires to have its voices heard at the global level. So they tried to draft something relevant to the African Union, linked to development and education, and then they shared that with global partners. So the basic assumption was that the African voice would have been heard loud and clear this time around. So the presence of unfair, exclusive global governance system kind of triggers and drives the development of the three education and development policy documents by the African Union. So these are linked to findings linked specifically to the emergence of the African version of the SDGs. The other part, which I will be quick, is linked to the hegemonic status of the African Sustainable Development Goals. So the question is that how and to what extent the African version of the SDGs are accepted at the continental and global level. So that's $1 million question. But the three documents, they kind of leave important traces of strategies the African Union is using to make sure that its version of the SDGs are going to be relevant and significant to the continent. And by implication, they are going to be accepted by its member nations and accepted by its global partners. One strategy used in all the three documents is linked to this idea of scientization and rationalization. So the basic assumption is that when it comes to making the three policy strategies, primary importance and significance was given to the power of scientific evidence. So they have SWOT analysis conducted, and they have surveys conducted across member countries to identify their emerging needs, their specific challenge, and stuff like that. So based on this scientific way of collecting and analyzing data, they identify specific implications, which kind of inform the articulation of the African version of the SDGs. So this is kind of something absolutely new to the African continent. Historically, the continent has been relying entirely on normative expectations when it comes to making policies. What does that mean? They just simply subscribe to the norm that, education is a human right. Education is critical for development. The UNESCO and the UN in general, they require that education should be organized and provided free of charge, etc., etc. So all the justifications historically were linked to this normative expectation. But this time around, when it comes to the 2030 SDGs, the African Union really believes in the power of science and reason. The other one is linked to collecting so much input from the various stakeholders, such as governments and ministries of education, trade unions, teacher unions, civil society organizations, people who appear to be really marginalized, etc., etc. So they were consulted during the process of articulating the African version of the SDGs. So this was, again, a substantial shift in the business of the African Union. And in the three documents, this state of affairs is explicitly articulated or explained as a paradigm shift in the way the African Union is doing its business. So this is one more. I think I got to skip the rest. So my conclusions are the following, When it comes to the 2030 SDGs, the African Union appears to use alternative strategies. So, for example, they have used what we call strategic adoption of the global sustainable development goals. In this strategy, the African Union tries to do some calculations about the benefits and cost of including some ideas of the global SDGs. So they believe that the SDGs, they include significant ideas which are equally relevant to African reality, such as the environment, such as humanity, such as sustainability, such as terrorism, etc., etc. So it's beneficial to include the ideas of global SDGs. But at times, excluding the SDGs, the global SDGs is impossible. Why? Because it's costly for the African Union. So it's linked to the idea that we got to include some ideas of the global SDGs. Why? Because we have some of the worst quality and relevance of education, because we have some corrupt governance system going on, and because we are going to be named and shamed in international circles, such as in the circles of the UNESCO. So because of this, they resorted to the use of strategic adoption. The other one is linked to principled adoption. The basic argument here is that, yes, SDGs are, after all, created by international organizations and the UNESCO, to which the 55 countries which created the African Union are a member of. So what does that mean by implication? So we got to believe in the existence of a culturally shared global community. So that means it makes sense to appeal to these global norms, the norms expected by international organizations. But we have another strategy, more advanced one, strategic adaptation. So the African Union at times argues that, okay, I'm not going to include the sustainable development goals in their entirety because Africa is a unique continent. So we got specific emerging needs and challenge within the continent. So we got to draw on Pan-Africanism, we got to draw on African Renaissance, and then we got to draw on emerging African needs linked to quality and relevance of education. So because of this local embeddedness, they resorted to strategic adaptation. So that's why the three documents, they have significant local content included in them. The last one is principled adaptation. This is kind of a tricky one, but you will notice it. You will see it in all the three policy documents. The basic idea is that, as I have indicated minutes ago, the African Union has got ideational disagreement with global governance, with the UNESCO, with the World Bank, and with all the other international organizations. Why? Because the African Union feels and believes that it has been intentionally discriminated, sidelined, and marginalized from making education policies and policies linked to development in general. So in a nutshell, we could say that all these alternative strategies of adapting and adopting the global sustainable development goals vis-a-vis emerging African needs and realities appear to be used by the African Union. So the African Union positions itself as kind of an intermediary arrangement between globalism, that means global education regimes, and localism, such as the 55 member nations. I think I got to stop here. Thank you for your patience, fam. I took so much time, I think.
Oh, of course. No, don't worry about that. I mean, it's great. I mean, I just try to say with people that I'm gonna listen about this for a couple more hours because I'm doing working on the SDG too, and I do understand that. I have a couple of friends from Africa, and we work on some nonprofit in Africa too, and centenization, the goal six of the water centenization in Africa. That's a lot of challenge up there and well, and see it in the big perspective of the SDGs, sustainability and policy chains and the government chains and how it deal with the complexity of multilateral organization like the African Union is a lot of work. I gotta say that. And we can talk about every layer for a couple of days. So that's why I really
Definitely.
appreciate you provide us the great concept because we got to understand this term of education reform and policy as a big thing because that is how the policy doing. They deal with the big things and how you reform it. You work on the big mechanism. So the way you see got a little bit abstract and a bit gotta be comprehensive, then practical way, empirical apply in one case, and how about other case? How about other countries? There's not a lot of things to do. But thank you so much, sir. And I just text you Liama that definitely I'll be in contact with you after this. We gotta talk
My
about
pleasure.
something about this because I
Very
love
good.
to have this growth and definitely go beyond. Thank you so much, sir. And I have here second on the list, Dr. Badia Vilzo, and she will work with us, I believe, with her significant study on the social justice, I believe, educational justice, and school as an agent in socialization that I assume, which is really provide the soul and the interesting, right, the human part of the structure and policy that we sometimes we forgot it. We just think about paper and principles and words and kind of thing, but human is important. Society is important, and that's why I like about the school education. We blend between that, and I really happy to have Dr. Valdievezo in here to have us guide us in this field. Please.
Thank you so much. I know that this is not meant to be a purely academic setting or for a presentation in that fashion. However, I have some images and I wonder if I could share them with you. And so here we go. This is the first one. Oops. Can you see?
Yep, we can see
Okay.
it.
All right. So
Yes.
thank you so much for your introduction, Tony. And thank you also to Dr. Bekele for his presentation. I have so many notes about your excellent presentation of the topics. And to talk about that human aspect, I think that for me it's important also because I'm not detached from that. So I look at what people are saying, what people are doing in a way to understand policy in very, very local settings. So I do look at the classroom and I do look at what people are doing, teachers, for example, how they are implementing policy through pedagogy. In that way, we can have a policy that is multicultural, called multicultural, social justice, inclusive, inclusive of diversity, and on the paper, right? But when we look at practice, we may see actually that is the opposite is happening. So my way of looking at policy then is by looking at what actors are doing at the local level, in the classroom particularly. So I wanted to show you this picture because that shows a little bit of what I do, the people I'm connected with. And also, if you see in the center, you have patterns of beautiful weaving. And I look at patterns. I look at what happens at the local level and use that to compare it to policy in discourse at the official formal level of the government or some intermediary institutions, including also settings for teachers' professional development. And so I look at how teachers are prepared, supported, or how kind of professional development. I don't like to use the word training. I like to use the word professional development because it's deeper what we do when we prepare teachers than just training someone to do something. It involves also who they are. And when I was talking about the initiatives, I look at what is going on at the local level as well as at the global level. So, there are, Dr. Bekele also allude to, the global initiatives. In my case, I look at those in layers of, the initiatives, the goals, and also what's going on at the level of government policy and programs. And I include in my analysis the view of what has been happening historically in schools with policy, and in the case of bilingual intercultural education that I have been studying in Peru, I look at the school also as a site of colonial affirmation, if I can use that word, and the ways in which school has meant especially for marginalized populations like the indigenous peoples in Peru, it has meant the ways in which sometimes in a very violent manner, children, the youth are discouraged from using their own language, from learning their own language, and from being indigenous. So the history of the schoolhouse has been actually quite violent for indigenous peoples, while the talk was about giving the people the opportunity to fully develop as citizens of the country, to be contributors to the society. That was the talk, but the action in schools were about stripping children from their identity in violent ways, in their culture, their language. So that history doesn't stay in the past, but has been carried through all these, generations and decades, and has impacted, of course, the ways in which new policies are not only designed, but also implemented. So how do? You have this beautifully worded policy that talks about inclusion, multicultural education, the ways in which we want to really attend to the marginalized populations, etc., socially just education, when at the ground level, what is happening is very problematic. So how do you change that? And for me, when I look at the change of policy, I, of course, consider the importance of what is going on at the government levels or the global initiatives. But if we are not doing anything in the classroom that really changes or transforms education the way that is happening, that is, that has that carcass of the colonialism, then we are not really changing more than just the discourse. And so here I have an image that describes the kinds of perspectives that I use for my analysis, aside from talking about the global initiatives and looking at what is going on, because those global initiatives actually influence, right, the ways in which policies are undertaken. In the case of Peru, for example, and in many Latin American countries, we use the language, from the global initiatives. So we kind of signal in that way to the international community that we are following these new initiatives. And we don't do that, or governments don't do that just because they want to follow the policy, but also because that attracts funding, especially for education, that is really neglected in terms of funding within the government. We have to attract monies from outside. And so we signal with that same language of the global initiatives, we signal that, okay, we're doing this. So then we receive the international aid to help with that kind of, I'm sorry, I didn't want to do that. That helps us implement that, at least on paper, right? Because as I said, I look at the local, and sometimes at the local level, we have very problematic situations where these initiatives are completely opposite, and they are a continuation of colonialism instead of transformation towards socially just education. You see in the image that I have the history from the colonial era to the present, but also looking at the macro and the micro. So, the governmental policy that is expressed on paper, the laws, the regulations, and then what happens in the classroom. So my analysis of practice, of pedagogy, of the implementation of, for example, socially just education, intercultural education at the local level, looks at what's happening at the local in comparison to what goes on at the micro level, at the macro level. And some features of, in this case, intercultural bilingual education that I think really are relatable and parallel to what goes on not only in bilingual education, but in general in the schools in Peru, is that the Ministry of Education that, for example, mandates bilingual education for indigenous communities does this as a way to signal that they are using policies that are for inclusion, policies that are about justice and equity. And however, the ways in which they are understood at the level, not only of the classroom, but also even the professional development of teachers, is that, for example, when we talk about language, we don't talk about culture. And how can you do that? You separate language from culture, and that is problematic in itself because it's not considering the necessary identities of the populations that we are trying to tend to. So there are things there that really need a very critical view on what is going on with intercultural bilingual education. Something that is a topic that I think relates to many initiatives, not only in Peru, but in Latin America. And I think also in other continents, is that this design of policies, even with a beautiful wording, are still top down, meaning that we, for example, in the case of Peru, borrow the language that the global initiatives are talking about, but we don't really know much about what the real strengths or needs are at the local level. So we bring something and we want to implement it without knowing who are the people who this policy is going to benefit. So, and that's really problematic. Just, for example, the initiative of saying that children should be taught in their mother tongue. That is an initiative that is part of indigenous agreements also at the global level, that children have the right to receive education in their own language. So when we go to an indigenous community, indigenous schools, sometimes we find that, for example, parents or the community that don't agree with this. And they want their children to learn with the in this case of Peru has several official languages, but for a long time the Spanish, the colonial language, as the official language. And this still carries to the day because in many communities, this is rejected. It's rejected, the fact that children should learn in their own language. And there's an explanation for that. Of course, if you as a parent have your child in a school and you want the best future for your child, and based on their education, you will like a way in which your child is included, it can have access to social mobility and different things. So in this case, parents would think, okay, Quechua, for example, one of the indigenous languages, is stigmatized. People are stigmatized. If you are an indigenous person, you are excluded. You are not even considered to be a citizen sometimes. And with all of this complexity that carries, long history of relations at the social level, you have to question, is my child going to have access to all of this if my child only learns in their indigenous language? So, or their mother tongue. So there's these types of fears that are still present in a lot of the communities because stigma still exists against indigenous peoples' language, cultures, and identities. So bringing a policy that is beautifully worded and talks about inclusion is not something that people who live the day by day exclusion and discrimination is going to just simply accept. So there's a need of a dialogue to be established at the beginning or prior to trying to implement policies. And I would argue further that we need to really, and this I think echoes some of what has been mentioned already, that we need to develop something that comes from the local level, that has engaged people who are in the ground really implementing these policies for change. Otherwise, we are still trying to do top down things that do very little to transform processes and what happens at the micro level into something that is equitable, that is socially just. So this is part of the big work that we have to do, really listening to the voices of understanding and learning from what goes on, and the people who have the experience at the local level, the educators, for example, who are in these schools. In the work that I have done, I have looked at educators' voices. I have looked at educators' practices. And, you have these competing ideologies of a teacher, like this 5th grade teacher that talks about, that I have here in the slide. The students have to learn the correct way to use their language and to become fluent in Spanish. So the emphasis of learning the colonial language and not so much about learning their indigenous language. And still the view, because in practice it happens, that is still the view that Spanish is their main ticket to social mobility. In a history of stigma against indigenous language and culture, of course, the belief is that Spanish is going to get you out of there or move you. It is much more complex than that, but the kind of the common understanding is that still you will be hold or you wouldn't advance or have that opportunity if you just are an indigenous person. You also have teachers who think that, that indigenous education, in this case, intercultural bilingual education, mean that we're learning here in these schools from their own local language and culture. And it should include indigenous values. It should include not only that parts of experience in the curriculum, but also their world cosmovision, worldview, that can be another knowledge that is just as valuable as what we consider formal academic knowledge. That's a very interesting point, that in colonial education, if I can refer to it like that, the knowledge, not only the indigenous people is excluded as indigenous person and should, get rid of their language and their identity, but also their knowledge, their way of being in or exist in the world, is also something that is minor or that is not valuable, not scientific. So that's the dichotomy that is created. And only one kind of knowledge is valued. The knowledge that is created in academic settings, for example, or the knowledge that is called scientific versus the non-scientific, that is the indigenous. So that's another kind of ideology and belief that exists in society. And what this teacher is telling us is that, you know, we have to educate from the knowledge and the values and the identity, the culture, and the language from the indigenous local level. Just, I think, a very important idea here too. And it's not talking about canceling other knowledges, canceling, you know, the knowledge in curriculum that already exists, but adding and using that as a way to bring access for this youth and children to more equitable education. And so I want to conclude with three main thoughts that in the research that I have done of education policy and programs, there is always these tensions and contradictions between the policy of inclusion and its local implementation. And education also has, as the, you know, if you think of the schoolhouse, it is the institution that has reaffirmed or impose these views that feed exclusionary practices towards marginalized populations. Another thought is that practices that I have observed in my studies of bilingual intercultural education sometimes gives us great light into what transformational practice looks like. So teachers really have knowledge and the views that should be taken into account. So there's the teachers who not only think that culture should be included, but they did teach in ways that were actually countering the top-down ways of doing education. And they included the language in ways that were very innovative in their classrooms, in ways of knowledge, different knowledges were also part of the ways in which they taught in their classrooms. That was really illuminating to see that the teachers, because of their experience and also their sensitivities towards the communities where they taught, they were able to develop these very innovative practices that I think shouldn't be discounted at all when we talk about transformational education. But I see a lot of seeds of transformation in what teachers are doing. It's not something that happens all the time, because sometimes it's discouraged that they do that. Actually, I have seen ministers, people who work at the Ministry of Education coming to evaluate the teachers and actually criticizing them for talking about knowledges that were indigenous. And so that was absolutely, if I look at it, absolutely opposite to what intercultural education should be. But you had these officials criticizing the teachers for actually doing something innovative. So that is some questionable things that happen coming from the top and discouraging really change or transformation. And a third point is documenting responses to neoliberalism and the culturalization in education. I think that allow us to see those possibilities of seeds of change towards social justice, things that are already happening. So from my decades of looking at classrooms and seeing what teachers are doing, you see a lot of things that are concerning, but also actions that are really innovative. And I think that we need to pay more attention to that if we want to transform at the macro level the policies that are, trying to tend to equity and social justice. We need research to continue research that is looking at the local practice. Well, I love to continue with that to contribute, the kind of knowledge to our collective thinking of how we can transform education towards a more equitable society, more equitable world. And that's how, at this point, I'm going to close my first conversation with you and hope to engage with, different questions. And I want to hear about your ideas as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's good to see
great.
you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I have a connection to Peru. I was there for almost 2 years between 2013 and 15 and back there just in January. And definitely the realities you described, I remember and I witnessed them again in January. There's that discrimination and marginalization of indigenous peoples, Afro-Peruvians, Peruvians who have any Asian heritage, Chinese or Japanese. And there's so much internal migration in the country that you have people going to the coast trying to find work, leaving rural mountainous or Amazonian communities to try and make it work in the formal economy of coastal areas, but then they're far away from where indigenous languages are more dominant. And it's tragic. It's really sad to see what globalization and capitalism and neoliberalism are doing to a country that is very much still suffering from colonial legacies and realities that just are so much part of the present day, 500 and some years later. So thank you for your thoughts. And
thank you, Kiera. So great to see you.
It's so good to see you. I didn't know if I could make it. I left work early I had to teach some classes this morning, but I scheduled to make it. And also to Dr. Bekele, thank you. I only got that last part of your presentation, but I enjoyed it as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Claire.
I do have a question for Professor Valdivieso. So thank you so much. It was very interesting. And my question is related to what do you say about the communities that they that they don't support to receive that the children receive their education in their mother tongue. So I'm wondering, like, what kind of approach should be like? I know there is no idea approach, right? And it depends on the community, but what is the correct way or the path that they should follow at a local level, but still engage in the government level?
Yeah. Thank you for your question. I think that what I have witnessed is something that I will use to address your question is, for example, when that happened in the communities that I was studying, the teachers organized a conference with the parents. And so there were moments in which the parents talk about, what their concerns were and some of the complaints, and the teachers responded. So the fact that the teachers wanted the parents to be part of this dialogue was important. The dialogue was I think, filled with tensions, but it was important that they were there, and the teachers were able to explain certain things, like, for example, that children are not only using their language, but also reading and writing in their language. That was not the experience of parents themselves when they were growing up, if they had any schooling, not reading and writing in their own language. So the teachers tried to use examples of things that children were doing that were building the value of their language, and also how it compared to just learning in Spanish. And sometimes teachers got really heated, and he said, you are yourself. I remember this interaction when one teacher told a parent, you're yourself a product of Spanish only education. And where are you now? And wouldn't you like your child to speak both languages instead of just one? And so that was in the moment, the teachers was responding, perhaps in not to using not too kind words, but it was addressing something that revealed that, of course, if children go and learn only in Spanish, is that going to, in your own experience, learning only in Spanish, is that placing you in a better place? So there are more complexities to that, but, a response that includes parents, that establishes a dialogue, is a response that pays attention to the processes of inclusion, right? I think that's a good start. I think the teachers were doing, something that was going to be productive, including the parents. Some teachers also invited the parents to come to school, also to share, to do some presentations. And so the relationship between the school and the community became closer, because if in the colonial framework, you will have the school and the community as separate and opposite, because your community is about being indigenous, which was already stigmatized, right? So the school is your ticket to social mobility. And so that was always separate and different and opposite. And here, what teachers were trying to do is build the relationship in which the knowledge of the community, the wisdom of the parents, the experiences were included in the education, valued and included. So those are important steps, I think, that communities can take. And again, you very well said also that each community is unique, but what I witnessed, I would say that was illuminating for me, to see the ways in which teachers were trying to establish these connections and to hear the voices of the parents, even when there were all these very heated discussions. I think that were productive discussions as well.
Thank you so much, Laura. Yeah, sorry, as a thought out network, so I cannot keep the flow of our conversation. But thank you for that. Some question we can save a couple more question in after the speech of Dr. Mayer that are related to his experience with the Laos, PDRs, and UNICEF and global affairs. I'm surprisingly to see that all the guest speakers here today will share a lot of the same worldview of these situations and how we articulate it. We just start to use that different empirical study on that. But you guys see the similarity about the SDG, sustainability, and all kind of reform, cultural, start on classroom, and different stakeholder and the challenge of the policy. We're gonna have some challenge from donors in here and national interest with the challenge of politics from Dr. Mayers too. Please welcome Dr. Mayers.
Mute. Okay, I'm unmuted now.
Yes, you are.
Am I muted or unmuted? I'm unmuted. Good, I can start.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk about, thank you very much for my predecessors, and here is a quick presentation on cases from Lao PDR, where I was living for the past 8 years before coming back to the US. So in Lao, it's a landlocked country, mountainous. It's 7 million plus people are scattered in a 7,000. So you have a lot of small villages scattered around with small schools and small public services, limited employment, limited industry, pretty low socioeconomic status. They say it's the sub-Saharan African country of Southeast Asia. It's quite poor in comparison to its neighbors. Most people are on daily wage labor or subsistence farming and foraging. Very limited employment outside of government, civil service, or if you're doing some self-employment or daily wage labor. Indicator-wise, like I say, 30% of children are stunted. It's 40-some% malnourished. There's lots and lots of sad indicators about women and children, et cetera, in education. They've invested a lot in improving access to primary schools. They've built a lot of schools, but the learning that's going on in those schools and the really low completion rates is a concern. Very few students reach secondary schools, and even fewer can complete the secondary leaving examination. So it's less than 10% of the children who start primary can actually graduate from high school. So it's just a context, it's a People's Democratic Republic. So there's a one-party system, and there's a real difference in views between the development partners and the government on the directions of development. It's ranked quite low on worldwide governance indicators, meaning there's very limited transparency, there's no media, there's only one. It's low on all the indicators except political stability. There's been a very stable political system in place since the independence in 1975, the socialist revolution. Right now, they're a bit in crisis mode with extremely high national debt. Their annual debt way out exceeds the cash flow that they have, the hard currency they have. The Lao kip has devalued drastically in the past 2 years, which is really compounded with the low government salaries. Like I said, the majority of people who are employed outside of the house are government employees, and the starting salary is less than $100 a month. There's a lot of complaints from the development partners that the government needs to invest more of its budget into education and the health sector, but they really haven't increased that. And extreme high dependence on donor funds for health, education, social services, et cetera. So how does education policy come about in Lao? Well, the leading thing is their national development plan. They're in the middle of that right now. And for education, there's also a 5-year plan, which, it's developed jointly between the government and the development partners. And like most countries, there is an education sector working group, which kind of oversees the development of the national plan, reviews the national plan, looks at the budget and the donor funds and the government funds coming in. So there's a very large mechanism of education sector working group and the subsector working groups. And this is standard operating processes in most developing countries. What's a little bit different in Southeast Asia is the groups are often chaired by the government, and the development partners come in as co-chairs. with limited say. They can't really call the meetings without government approval. So it's a government-driven process on this, which is good for Lao, but it causes some issues. Now, by having all this nomenclature, this sector working group, the subsector working groups, all these systems, it allows Lao to be considered for the Global Partnership for Education, GPE funding. And these are grants rather than loans that come from the World Bank and others. And in the Laos case, the current 4-year, 3 to 4 year is a 70 million grant. So, but to receive this money, there are certain non-negotiable policies or actions the government has to take in order to get these resources, these free funds. So here's this tension of who gets to call the policies for Lao. Is it the development partners or is it actually the national government? So the standard tension that takes place at the national level. So here's a big issue for Laos that's being debated between the partners and the government is public finance reform. This huge debt. The government took major loans mainly from China, from state banks in China, to invest in hydropower. And there's been limited returns on these, but extremely high debt payments now coming due. So there's also very high spending on the inflated civil service sector. So across the army, the education, the health, etc., it's all the state industries that exist. There's really high levels of resources, and including in education, the major payment in education, 95% of it is going towards teacher salaries, teacher and staff salaries. So that's a big concern to the development partners, as well as the fact that Lao isn't so transparent with its budgets and its spending. So it's a very murky, but everyone sees that there's just not enough money that goes to education. So the partners are insisting on public finance reform. They want fiscal austerity, and these are the prerequisites for getting this global partnership on education funding and other fundings to other sectors, including nutrition and health. So there's this tension of public finance reform before you get more money, but the country being so poor, it really needs more money. So what can they cut? So it's standard that you see in many contexts. So here are two new policies I want to just briefly talk about. And the first one is, the general goal is to reduce the size of the civil service, to reduce teacher salaries as the portion of the education budget. So this is a big push from the donors. Stop having so much money going to the teacher salaries and overheads. So two policies were initiated back in 2020, 2021. The first one is on a ceiling on hiring of new teachers. So the government finally acquiesced, and they will not replace vacant teaching positions now. The size of the student population is going down, and the government says you've got more than enough teachers the way it is, so no more hiring. And the government finally had to agree. And the second policy that came about was no more volunteer teachers. And these were teachers that can be hired at the local level, at the school or the district, and they're paid just a small portion. I mean, if a monthly salary is $80, these guys would be getting $10 to $15. And they're educated community members. Maybe they were a high school graduate or college graduate, or they made it to college. They're one of the very few who reached there, but never got a real job in the civil service. They weren't connected enough. So they come back to the community and they can help out at the school. And the new policy is that has to stop. It's considered an unregulated, kind of waste of resources on a semi-civil service cadre that really isn't employed. So now I'm just going to unpack it. I only have a little bit of time left here. So the first policy on the hiring of new teachers, what's the implications of that? So the education sector working group, they really put the pressure on it, and it was part of the global partnership, the GPE budget, is that they had to reduce the hiring of new teachers to 50 teachers a year, which is like several thousand teachers below the attrition level, but they're not allowed to hire more than 50 teachers. However, these education colleges are still in existence. They're still fully staffed around each of the country's provinces, and they're still training students to become teachers for whom there are no jobs, right? There's no, they're not going to get hired. Only maybe 3 teachers per province can get hired. But the teacher training colleges, our education colleges, are still cranking out new teachers. So now they're stuck. What could be the new role of the education colleges if they're not making teachers? Should they start doing more in-service teacher training, which is what the Department of Teacher Education does? Or should they start doing observations and supervisory support to school? I mean, there's a big cadre of teachers, of faculty at these education colleges who are training teachers still for whom there are no positions. So how does one policy kick on to another policy? Is it the government has to clean this, or is it the donors who pushed it to begin with? So until a new policy comes up on the role of education colleges, as long as there's a hiring freeze, what are we going to do with all these graduates of the education colleges? So it's a conundrum, and it's not sure what to do, but certainly these graduates are not going to be hired as teachers. So the second policy that came out of this public reform, public finance reform, is around the volunteer teachers. And actually, when this was put into effect, the stopping of volunteers, it wasn't only volunteer teachers, it was volunteer forestry workers, volunteer lawyer, legal support people, volunteer health people, public health. I mean, so at all levels, for very small money, you could increase the number of people working at a local level. However, it was stopped. So in the case of volunteer teachers, these are small schools, remember, small villages all scattered around the country. So the school may have 2 to 3 teachers for 5 grades or 4 teachers for 5 grades. And if someone's missing, if there's no one to fill in for them, that class most probably won't function until the teacher comes back. So if a teacher leaves for training or the teacher leaves because of an illness, there's no option to cover their absence if you don't have these volunteer teachers there. So, and these volunteer teachers were educated community members who return after they've finished their schooling and they couldn't find a real job somewhere, so they're back in the village. And as a result now, they can only find daily wage jobs. There aren't any volunteer jobs. They've lost their volunteer teaching position, and now the income is only working at a banana farm or working on a construction site where you get daily wages. And your education level has no impact on your income. So some of the outcomes that they're recording now of this new policy, right? Student absenteeism is increasing, or student attendance, because classes don't function if there's no teacher substitutes when the teacher is missing. And at lower secondary level, there's been a big drop in retention and in enrollment in the past 3 years. And research into this is finding that young people who see more educated folks in their village, community members, neighbors, extended family, who had pretty high levels of education and were making only, $15 a month, it was something, they've now all lost their jobs as volunteers. So what's the point of going to school when everyone you see who did do well in school has even lost their volunteer position? It's quite a demoralizing thing happening across the secondary schools of the country. So now they're left with, what's the new policy? We can't have volunteers. So how do we reinforce the link that your education is actually going to get you into a position where you can earn more money? And that's where they're kind of stuck right now, because there's a higher and higher exodus from secondary schools, because all that investment of time and resources and uniforms, etc., to get through secondary school, in the end, chances are, even those who have done it they've lost their volunteer position. So it's a bleak future. So what would be the future policies that can make young people feel staying in school is really worth the effort? And the government is really struggling, and there's limited physical space to introduce new programs. So not to be too bleak, they're still plugging away, they're still doing their best, but these are the tensions between development partners saying one thing and government facing a different set of realities in their context. And there, I'll stop and give us all time for more discussion.
Thank you so much, Mayor. Yeah, it's great. Perfect time. So we can have, I think, 30 minutes for general discussion. Yeah, of course, Dialma, as the first one who don't have any change to say, please go ahead.
Okay, hi. So first of all, I would like to thank all of you. Okay, Dr. Lara, Dr. Teklu, and Dr. Cliff as well. So thank you a lot for all presentations, insightful and engaging presentation. I truly gained valuable knowledge from every one of them. But what I found from the three presentations here so far, really, I resonated with all of them. And I found like commonly this is kind of a question of how does the marginalization of local indigenous peoples' identities, knowledge, and perspectives in education reform initiatives represent a global phenomenon. It's merely reflecting broader patterns of cultural hegemony and colonial legacies across different regions and contexts. And even the goal set by donors, how it influences government policies, thereby impacting the transformation of all policies. All of that coming together from the three presentations, this is resonating with me because this is what, while doing ethnography even in Egypt and being in our schools, our public schools in Egypt, I found all of these aspects there inside classrooms, like particularly this kind of the impact on cultural identity and this kind of perpetuating of power dynamics, and how the colonial education, which I call it colonial education, enforced this kind of ideologies and languages while suppressing our own knowledge and languages, our indigenous knowledge and language. And the problem is this is not only led to the erosion of this kind of cultural identities, but it's merely enriching unequal power relations. So I believe that when acknowledging these historical injustice, we can, in that sense, better understand the ongoing struggles for education equity and social justice. And I think this kind of broader context of global education reform should be even seen and highlighted, because it is not one country challenge anymore. It's a global challenge. And it's every country everywhere challenges, while this kind of wiping identities and ending indigenous knowledge is a global phenomena with this kind of like colonization education system that we do have it worldwide. But I find it very challenging while witnessing teachers, they are grappling all the time with the pressure to conform to their identities and to confirm their identities to the global universal definitions. And this is one of the challenging. I see it that we need to conform to universal definitions that making every society to advocate for, and the push at the global level towards the idea of uniformity, which is not affecting our personal identities only, but it's affecting policies and practices. So how can even to balance between this kind of, by donors, this kind of embracing this kind of diverse identities, while we are pushed towards this kind of standardized global norms because every country is pushed globally to that. I feel it very complicated. I don't know, this kind of thoughts I have been writing while listening to the three presentations. So I shared everything came to my mind based on what I have seen in schools in Egypt and what I have read so far, what I have experienced, and what I listened today in these great presentations. Floor is
Thank you. So this is more like a reflection than a question.
reflection and embedded with two questions. I feel that you lost with me with this kind of reflection. What are the questions? So the questions is mainly I need kind of stress more about, again, how does the marginalization of local indigenous people identities, knowledge, and perspectives in education reform initiatives represent global phenomena? It's like broader patterns of cultural hegemony and colonial legacy across different regions and contexts. I need else at the second question. I lost the second question. It's I lost it right now, but I can type it when I found it because like my paper came like I like this kind of scribbles everywhere because of my reflections. So the floor is yours.
Great. I think this question about indigenous community and marginalization will be focused on Dr. Laura. And then we can hear a little bit from other speakers too. I do have something to say about that, but of course, our guest could come first, right?
Oh, thank you. Well, I think that to address this problem, what we need, and it's not that I have the answer, but what we need is, for me, I look at processes too. So several people, several communities, several groups have to come together and work together because each may bring specific expertise that is useful. So look at it ecologically, if you can say that, and you can see that, you know, some actors benefit from their own expertise and perspective, a common cause, right? They benefited in ways that, you know, there's no one entity that can do it all. So we really need to bring different groups, different sectors, different actors together here. Some may have some more of a central role than others, but I don't think that performing change can happen in isolation, because what we're trying to transform is part of relations that have been going on of inequity, that have created, you know, poverty, that have you know, build situations of injustice. So those are part of relations. And to transform them, you need all these different actors to be involved in this process of transformation. May include dialogue. I think the dialogue is very important because a lot of the big decisions sometimes just come from the top, right? So that is not, even if there are, again, very well thought ideas there, they don't make any sense in the ground if just they come from the top. It's like something that is external, coming and talking in a different framework, talking to people who are living the experience daily. So yeah, so that ecological perspective, I think, is I would say a step. No one entity has the answer.
Thank you.
Lana, you're mute.
Yeah. No, I would like to listen before commenting.
Yeah, so please go ahead, Dr. Bekele.
Okay, so yeah, I would like to kind of add a quick remark on this significant question Lamia has raised. So you will not be able to get a concrete answer for sure. But yeah, it's good to sort of make it a little bit even more complex, yeah, to sort of problematize the topic itself. So yeah, because it has its own roots in colonialism, yeah, and then domination and dictation by the colonizers. So that means, for example, if you take Africa, modern education is kind of found to a colonial creation. And what does that mean? Curricula, they reflect Western ideas and culture and philosophy and knowledge systems. And even pedagogy was found to be mimicking what was really happening in the West. So that traditional lecture method has got its roots in the West. So that means pedagogy, including curriculum, and then by implication, student assessment, all these kind of were affected significantly by colonial mentality. But also it's good to sort of have the other side of the coin, yeah? It's not always the fact that the West imposes their culture on the South, no. So the South, we also tend to believe that the West is kind of more developed and is more modern and is more sophisticated, yeah? And what does that mean? It means that the West has got more quality and relevant education systems. So the West has got effective policies and strategies. And what does that mean? You just simply go for adopting and borrowing their policy ideas. So that's why so many ministries of education in so many African countries that travel across Europe and North America. What? Why? They just simply assume that there might be some relevant policies out there in the West and in North America specifically. So that means countries in the global South, including those in Africa, they really believe that they got to copy or adopt knowledge systems from the West. So that means they are psychologically and philosophically dependent on the West. So the problem has something to do with the governments themselves and somehow it's linked to colonial legacy. But then interestingly, in Africa specifically, we tend to have a momentum and it comes under the name of decolonizing education. Okay, that's pretty interesting, yeah? So the basic idea is that so many researchers and people who tend to work at the intersection of research and policymaking and activism, they really believe that we got to do something about the colonized education system of African nations. So they're writing a lot on this specific topic, how to decolonize curriculum, for example, yeah? How to decolonize pedagogy, and how to decolonize student assessment, and how to decolonize school management and governance. So there are significant amount of efforts and discussions, including publications by interested African scholars. So this is kind of something promising, but in the end, as Laura said, it's going to be a collective effort. Yeah, ministries of education, they should jump in this kind of discussions, parents and communities, civil society, organizations, and all other stakeholders who believe that education is a critical addition to socioeconomic advancement, they should contribute to this kind of discussions. And maybe at some point in time, curriculum might become kind of, fairly speaking, representative of local knowledge systems, but still they can tap on what appears to be Western knowledge systems, because in the end, we're living in a single world, yeah? So maybe I can snatch something relevant from Vietnam and apply it somewhere in Egypt and in Ethiopia. That's absolutely possible, at least theoretically. So we can still learn something from the West, but a sizable portion of the knowledge system being taught in schools, I believe that it should emerge from existing local knowledge systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So
Thank you.
my comment that I like here. So back
I
to
think we should let Dr.
Other-
Mayers.
yeah, sorry.
Not much. I totally agree with what has just been said. I mean, the issues of the donor development community really putting their frameworks onto what is happening globally has, there are things, of course, to learn from each other, but the lack of investment in South-South exchange and building up the capacities of local institutions really perpetuates so many things. So I'll stop now. There's nothing more to say, but I will say I appreciate.
So in terms of donors, what is the reason behind then? Like, for example, in Egypt, World Bank right now, they are funding the education system in Egypt. What is the reason behind them that telling that we are not allowed to hire teachers anymore? So it's a critical question here, because if you are transforming the education system and you are trying to develop professionally teachers, so in that sense, I need to have fund for a professional development and hire more teachers who are on a yearly basis graduated from the faculties of education. So
Yeah.
what happens in the end after all of these donor allocations for this big number of money? There is no professional development. Teachers there is a problem and a challenge with the number of teachers in schools, because here there is a problem that we don't have enough teachers anymore. There's like, I remember the last report that we have a problem around 3,000 teachers that are not there anymore to cover a big number of schools in Egypt. Because of what? Because of the World Bank.
Yeah. I mean, you look at the US and how indebted it is, how it lives beyond its means. But then they look at countries of who they're providing foreign aid or foreign assistance, and it's a different set of rules. So, as you say, we need new teachers trained in new ways to really transform systems. And yet, the international community says, no, public finance, you have to live within your means, you can't borrow, you can't do that. It's just, it's classic. So this colonial mentality of do as we say, not as we do, continues.
And from an educator's stance, it's just destructive. It's a path for destruction of education in teachers.
Formal education and communities of practice.
Yeah.
Please, Sierra.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about many of the things that have been said. What you just said, Lamia, obviously it's a recipe for disaster when you're not training new teachers, and it's becoming a recipe for disaster in Laos, which I wasn't aware of, that situation. I think generally speaking, in many of the contexts I've been in, and with just a few exceptions of some countries in, for example, Scandinavia, I think the teaching profession is not respected by politicians very much, or at least as much as it should be. So many teachers are, even in countries where the pay has increased over years, even when there are unions advocating for teachers' rights and benefits and social security, the general sense is that you shouldn't become a teacher because it doesn't pay as well as a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or some other profession. And I find that really damaging within Canada, where I am, and within so many places, because you have this sense that somehow teaching is less than other professions. And then there seems to be a lack of respect coming from many levels of society. It's not across the board. And there are always the parents and the families and community members who do value what teachers do and how hard it is to do intercultural learning or bilingual learning. But you have a lot of people in the political sphere making decisions that affect people on the grounds with that, what Laura was saying with the top-down imposition of things, and coming from capital cities with federal education policies rather than local education policies, that is, it's just so damaging. Within Canada, I mean, Canada essentially had a very effective set of policies for mostly eradicating Indigenous peoples. It was absolutely tragic, and the last residential schools only closed in 1996. So those were essentially boarding schools where Indigenous students were sent to study and live and often do a lot of manual labor and not really learn a lot of school content, reading and writing. And so when I was in high school, there was one paragraph, like maybe a 2-sentence paragraph, not even really a paragraph, about Indigenous residential schools in Canada and about how the last one closed in 1996. It acted like, oh, it's, it's over. But the trauma that is extending from that, the intergenerational trauma, you had some families where 5 generations of kids were put in these schools that were run by religious orders, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, funded by the government of Canada, with the goal of assimilating Indigenous students, eradicating Indigenous languages and worldviews, belief systems, ways of dress, food preparation, everything. And so now in schools, there is a push towards truth and reconciliation, which is coming from a top-down federal level. There were inquiries into the atrocities that happen in residential schools, and there's more knowledge available. There's more media, interviews, videos, all sorts of things available about what went on in residential schools. But in teacher education programs, there's this sense that you have to cover certain aspects of curriculum the government is telling you to do. And I have witnessed teachers say that they don't want to cover certain aspects about Indigenous peoples because they still believe themselves that Indigenous peoples are somehow inferior and that they just receive government handouts and that they're alcoholics. And I've heard horrible things from future teachers who were going to into schools. And there was that sense that nothing was really going to stop them from becoming a certified teacher. They didn't have to do anything more than just pass a course in university. And it was this top-down imposition, which I don't think allowed for enough dialogue and enough communication and simply just knowing Indigenous peoples. I think a lot of people haven't interacted enough with Indigenous peoples. And so there's this division in society where people aren't actually aware or able to just sit and have a friendly conversation, not about, really historical, deep, complicated things, but just daily life in the same city where they may live. And anyways, I'm just trying to say here that like the top-down methods are really challenging. And I think the most successful initiatives I've seen have been local schools, local Indigenous schools or local schools that are public schools that bring in guest speakers, that bring in Indigenous artists, storytellers, have people come and engage, invite parents, invite grandparents, invite community together, as Laura was saying, for appreciating the beauty of Indigenous cultures, appreciating worldviews, and also getting into some of the more complex conflicts that may exist within communities to try and just bridge spaces of dialogues that allow for people to come to know each other and reduce the stereotypes that people have of one another.
Thank you so much. She's touching a lot of questions, a lot of what's that situation and issue we have in here, and even in Canada, even in the United States, which you have in here too. Marcela or Dixon, do you guys have any questions?
No, thank you so much. I just want to say the 3 of you, thank you so much. It was really amazing being here and listening to you, the 3 perspectives. I mean, like you very much covered 3 different cultures, and yeah, very glad to participate. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcela.
Thank you. So okay, so I guess have 5 more minutes left. I can share some of my ideas, and then we can wrap up. Respect the time, everybody. So my idea is, well, I think everything is connected. We all see that we all in the same kind of field of study, interest. So that's why we see that the education is but a humanistic type of approach that by human, right? And there's a lot of stakeholder, different type of people out there. Indigenous communities, of course, one small community, in other different type of community out there too. And of course, related to indigenous community, before I fall too deep into education, I just want to let you guys know, if you don't know that, indigenous community actually have really strong ground in sustainability development and sustainability lifestyle now. That's now UN and the researcher groups and other study worldwide start to study back about indigenous community culture of how do you live harmonize with ecology and nature when we just destroy the whole nature. That's what the whole point SDG is. Hey, give us back. Give us some of you guys' wisdom. And now indigenous people said, now you know, science and industry and, economies, development, capitalization, it make us go bigger, but it's not really sustainability. And we destroy our Mother Earth, kind of like that. So I really want to see, and I believe that a lot of people who sharing the idea of sustainability, development, want to see the develop and spread out the value in indigenous community worldwide. And I think that's a catch that indigenous community can connect with a global resort from different layer, so that can support for the cultural outbreak and development and spread out of that to tackle with the policy issues and colonizers, some kind of issue happen right now. That is something that just pop up in my idea. And of course, education in the United States, even we talk a lot about the dialogues that all the stakeholders first, as a civilized citizen, we should sit down and talk with each other first, have an agenda, share everybody's idea. And now we find the way that can we all go to the consensus to have the effective policy that local and government, everybody happy, and the international education donor happy. But that's what in theory we don't have that. Even in America, I gotta say, phenomena in public school now, teacher, faculty, I'm gonna talk about university, faculty who we think that are expert in the field, and the head department, and the dean of the college, and the president, and the board of regents, and other staff, and other graduate student, and the undergrad student, they do sit down, talk to each other. This is going nowhere because it's too big. It's too much. And even the board of regent and president and committee itself, they have a lot of information. They just cannot tolerate it. We have all the great mind in the same institution, but they cannot tolerate what people say. So that is a problem, our discourse and dialogue now today. That way. Thank you, Marcella. And that we have a solution. We all know the solution, but how to make it into action is still a challenge. I say even in the United States and even in Vietnam, where I come from. That I share a lot with Dr. Mayer said about the issue in Vietnam. We start feeling some really strange issue that we have too much teacher, but they cannot get a job. And then when we cut it down, we short of teacher, so we cannot find the equilibrium, the balance between that. Like in the United States, it's more like economic driven. Like now, people don't want to be a teacher because it's low pay, basically. And P12, they all quit. Not today. They all quit. And how the United States to deal with it? Well, add more funding. And second, let them do the online course. That's how they deal with that. So that is different. But it's not every country have a strong economic power like US to deal with that. That's why I'm do really share with the case in Peru, in Africa, in Vietnam, in Laos, in Asia. But the context will be like that. It's settled like that, imbalance, right? Someone's stronger, someone has more money. And we don't want to listen to each other. That's a huge challenge now today in every field is a thing. But anyway, thank you so much for spending 2 hours with us. We articulate. Here, I believe that we share our idea in here. We do the thing we commitment to do, that we show up in here, share our thought, and listen to each other. That's the important thing, and we hope that everybody can do it, right? That's how the world build up the world peace. But we keep practice this. I believe that Liam, we try to do it every month, right? Yes, to keep up the discourse in the under the light of science and great manner for the good and for the dedication of the development of our community. Of course, our society, because every strong community will go up to the strong society. So thank you so much, everybody being here, Laura and Dr. Bekele and Dr. Mayer. And of course, hopefully you have your contact after this, so we can discuss about further action plan that we can do it for the society. I'm more like practitioner. I like to have some action. That's what I like to do. I love to see everybody in here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam, and the rest of the team.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Have a good day,
Okay.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you
Take
so
care.
much.
Bye.